There's a photograph from New York City taken in 1870 on Broadway. The buildings stand magnificent, stone facades with intricate carvings that dwarf anything constructed today. But something in this image violates basic architectural logic. The windows sit at street level, not basement windows. Full-sized, ornate windows with detailed stonework positioned exactly where the sidewalk meets the building. Pedestrians walk past them without acknowledgement, as if it's perfectly normal to have ground floor windows that would require crawling to enter. This isn't an isolated anomaly. Photographs from Boston in 1865, London in 1880, Paris in 1875, and St. Petersburg in 1890 reveal the same impossible configuration. Buildings with their first floors buried, not partially buried, completely underground. What should be the main entrance, the grand doorways, the street-level architecture, all of it beneath the current ground surface. In every photograph, across every city, the modern street level sits anywhere from 8 to 15 feet higher than the original ground floor. The official explanation calls this raising the street grade. Historians claim cities gradually built up layers over time, streets paved and repaved, civilization slowly accumulating like geological sediment. It's a comfortable narrative that dissolves under minimal scrutiny. Consider the engineering reality of raising a street by 15 feet. This operation doesn't involve simply piling dirt on top of existing pavement. Every intersection requires elevation. Every cross street, every alley. The entire sewer system needs reconstruction. Water mains must be relocated. Utility lines demand reconfiguration. Retaining walls become necessary to contain the added earth. New staircases must be built. Access points redesigned. Every property owner must modify their buildings to accommodate the new ground level. The logistics of raising an entire city street elevation by 15 feet represents one of the most expensive, complex, time-consuming infrastructure projects imaginable. Yet the historical record suggests that every major city in the Northern Hemisphere completed this task simultaneously between 1800 and 1850. The civil engineering records for this supposed massive undertaking don't exist. There are no budget allocations, no project timelines, no documented complaints from business owners about losing their ground floors, no newspaper articles covering decade-long construction that would have paralyzed urban commerce. The historical record maintains complete silence about what should have been the largest infrastructure project of the 19th century. What does exist is the physical evidence: buried doorways, subterranean windows, first floors that have become basements, and most revealing of all, the layer itself, the material that buried these buildings. In Chicago, during subway construction in 1939, workers documented their excavation findings. Beneath the modern street level, they found the original 1850s street surface. And between the two levels, they discovered something unexpected. Not compacted layers of pavement and construction debris accumulated over decades. Instead, a relatively uniform layer of fine sediment mixed with organic material. The consistency suggested rapid deposition, not gradual accumulation. Similar findings emerged from excavations in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. The layer between original street level and modern street level displayed characteristics inconsistent with slow urban buildup: uniform composition, minimal stratification, evidence of rapid, catastrophic deposition rather than century-long accumulation. An engineer named Daniel Burnham documented this phenomenon during his work on the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. In his private journals, never intended for publication, he described excavations that revealed a strange uniformity to the burial layer, as if deposited in a single event rather than accumulated over time. The buildings appear to have been submerged rather than buried by human activity. Burnham wasn't alone in his observations. During the construction of the London Underground between 1860 and 1870, workers reported finding original Roman-era streets buried under similar layers of fine sediment. The depth was consistent across the entire excavation area. Approximately 12 to 15 feet of accumulated material, showing characteristics that geologists would later associate with flood deposits or mudflow events. The official explanation attributes this to the Great Fire of London in 1666, claiming that rebuilding efforts raised the street level. But the Roman streets were already buried by the medieval period, centuries before the fire, and the medieval streets themselves show evidence of burial beneath another uniform layer, suggesting multiple events or one massive deposition that affected structures from different eras simultaneously. What becomes clear from examining these excavation records is that the burial wasn't gradual. It was sudden. And it wasn't localized. It was global. Photographs from the 1860s and 1870s reveal another disturbing pattern. In city after city, buildings stand empty. Not abandoned in the modern sense, with broken windows and graffiti. Empty in a stranger way. Structurally perfect, but uninhabited. Streets devoid of the commercial activity such grand buildings would suggest. In an 1867 photograph of Philadelphia, an entire block of magnificent commercial buildings shows no signs of occupancy. The windows are intact, the facades pristine, but there's no merchandise in the display windows, no signage, no indication that these buildings serve any function. A British photographer named Francis Bedford documented this phenomenon during his travels through Europe in 1862. His photographs of Vienna, Prague, and Budapest show identical patterns. Magnificent architecture, empty streets, buildings that appear complete but unused. In his travel diary, Bedford wrote, "One cannot escape the impression that these cities have been recently vacated or perhaps recently occupied. The buildings possess a grandeur suggesting great age, yet the cities themselves feel newly inhabited, as if we have moved into structures built by others." This observation appears repeatedly in travel accounts from the mid-1800s. American writer Mark Twain, during his 1867 travels through Europe and the Middle East, noted in personal letters that many ancient cities felt strangely empty despite their magnificence, as if designed for populations far larger than currently inhabit them. The census records from this period support this impression. In 1800, New York City's population was documented at approximately 60,000. By 1850, it had exploded to 515,000, an increase of nearly 760% in 50 years. Philadelphia went from 41,000 to 340,000. Boston from 25,000 to 177,000. These aren't normal growth rates. These are repopulation rates. Similar demographic explosions occurred simultaneously across Europe. London's population increased from 1 million in 1800 to 2.7 million by 1850. Paris went from 550,000 to 1.3 million. Moscow from 250,000 to 365,000. But here's what the demographic data reveals that historians don't discuss. The growth wasn't distributed evenly across age groups. Census records from the 1850s show unusual population pyramids, with disproportionate numbers in younger age brackets and strange gaps in middle-aged cohorts, as if an entire generation was missing. An 1857 census report from New York, buried in municipal archives, notes, "The unusual age distribution of the current population presents challenges for demographic modeling. The absence of middle-aged residents in proportions expected for a naturally growing population suggests either significant recent immigration of young families, or alternatively, a recent population establishment following a period of absence." That last phrase, population establishment following a period of absence, appears in multiple census documents from the 1850s. It's bureaucratic language attempting to describe something the officials couldn't quite explain: cities being repopulated after being empty. This connects directly to another mystery from the same period: the orphan crisis of the mid-1800s. Between 1850 and 1890, American cities reported overwhelming numbers of orphan children. Not orphans in the modern sense, children who lost parents to disease or accident. These were children with no verifiable family history at all, no documentation of parentage, no relatives claiming them, no baptismal records. They appeared in cities without origin stories. The orphan train movement, which operated from 1854 to 1929, transported an estimated 250,000 children from eastern cities to rural areas for adoption. The official explanation frames this as a charitable response to urban poverty. But the primary source documents tell a stranger story. Many of these children couldn't provide information about their parents, not because the parents were dead or absent, but because the children themselves didn't know. They had no memories of family, no knowledge of their origins. A social worker named Charles Loring Brace, who founded the Children's Aid Society in 1853, wrote in his private correspondence, "The number of children appearing without history in our cities defies conventional explanation. They arrive not as refugees with tales of hardship, but as if placed here without past. When questioned about their origins, many provide answers that make no sense, speaking of places that don't exist or events that couldn't have occurred." This wasn't limited to America. London, Paris, Berlin, and Moscow all reported similar phenomena: unexplained populations of children appearing in cities during the 1840s and 1850s with no verifiable origins. Orphanages overflowed. Charitable organizations struggled to process the numbers. And the children themselves, when old enough to record their own histories, often provided contradictory or impossible accounts of their early years. What could cause such a pattern? What event would simultaneously bury the first floors of buildings under uniform layers of sediment, create the appearance of cities being vacated and reoccupied, generate demographic data suggesting population replacement rather than growth, and produce generations of children without verifiable family histories? The geological evidence points toward a specific type of catastrophe: liquefaction events caused by massive seismic activity can generate mudflows that bury structures rapidly and uniformly. But liquefaction on the scale necessary to affect every major city in the Northern Hemisphere simultaneously would require seismic forces unprecedented in recorded history. There's another possibility, one that appears repeatedly in historical accounts from the early 1800s, though usually dismissed as exaggeration or misunderstanding. Multiple sources from the 1810s describe unusual atmospheric phenomena. Witnesses reported skies that remained dark during daytime hours, temperatures dropping dramatically during summer months, crops failing across entire continents. The year 1816 became known as the year without a summer. Historical records attribute this to the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in April 1815. The volcanic ash, according to the official explanation, circulated in the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and causing global temperature drops. But Tambora erupted in Indonesia. The atmospheric effects should have been most severe in the southern hemisphere and equatorial regions. Instead, the most dramatic impacts occurred in North America and Europe. New England experienced snow in June. Crops failed completely. Famine spread across Europe. China reported devastating crop failures and flooding. The pattern of impact doesn't match the pattern expected from a single volcanic eruption in Indonesia. Contemporary accounts describe something stranger than volcanic ash. A British naval officer stationed in the North Atlantic wrote in his log in July 1816, "The sky maintains a peculiar quality, not merely dark but dense, as if filled with suspended material of unusual character. The sea itself appears different, thicker, and when it rains, the water carries sediment that stains everything it touches." Similar descriptions appear in journals and letters from across the Northern Hemisphere. Rain that carried unusual sediment, skies that seemed filled with particulate matter far denser than volcanic ash, and most significantly, flooding of an unusual nature. The historical record from 1816 through the early 1820s documents extensive flooding across Europe, North America, and Asia. But these weren't typical floods caused by excessive rainfall or snowmelt. Contemporary accounts describe something different. Waters that appeared suddenly. Floods that carried massive amounts of sediment and mud. Deposition that buried ground-level structures. A German chronicler named Johann Steininger documented floods in the Rhine Valley in 1817 that he described as unlike any flood in living memory. The water came mixed with earth and clay, more mud than water, and when it receded, it left deposits of such depth that entire ground floors of buildings were buried. The streets required complete reconstruction at a new level above the deposited material. This same pattern appears in accounts from France, England, the Netherlands, and across the American eastern seaboard. Floods that weren't primarily water, but rather massive mudflows that buried the existing ground level and required cities to rebuild at higher elevations. Chinese records from the same period describe the Great Deluge of mud that affected multiple provinces. The Qing Dynasty archives document emergency responses to flooding events that buried entire villages and required reconstruction at elevated levels. Japanese sources describe similar events along coastal regions, with particular emphasis on the unusual composition of the flood material, described as earth falling from the sky mixed with rain. What could generate mud flows of this magnitude simultaneously across multiple continents? The mechanics of such an event require understanding a phenomenon that modern geology rarely addresses in historical contexts. Atmospheric rivers of suspended particulate matter, combined with extreme precipitation, can generate mud flows that travel hundreds of miles and deposit uniform layers across vast areas. But the scale described in these 1816-1820 accounts requires something more extreme. Something that would suspend massive amounts of earth material in the atmosphere and deposit it globally over a period of several years. There's evidence in ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica. Cores drilled through polar ice preserve atmospheric composition data going back thousands of years. Each layer of ice traps air bubbles from the year it formed, creating a chronological record of atmospheric conditions. The ice layers corresponding to 1815, 1820 show anomalies, unusual concentrations of terrestrial sediment particles. Not volcanic ash, which has distinct chemical signatures, but rather pulverized earth material of diverse mineral composition, suggesting multiple source regions. The concentration and distribution pattern indicates global atmospheric loading far exceeding what a single volcanic eruption could produce. A 2003 study of Greenland ice cores, published in the Journal of Geophysical Research, noted the sediment loading in the 1816 through 1820 ice layers presents a distribution pattern inconsistent with single-source volcanic deposition. The material composition suggests multiple terrestrial sources, possibly indicating widespread crustal disruption, or alternatively, a cometary impact event that generated global ejecta distribution. That last phrase, cometary impact event, opens disturbing possibilities. Impact events can generate atmospheric loading sufficient to bury structures globally. The mechanics are well understood from studying the KT boundary event that ended the dinosaurs. A large enough impact throws millions of tons of pulverized earth into the atmosphere. This material circulates globally, then precipitates out over months or years, sometimes mixing with precipitation to create massive mudflows. But here's what makes this particularly relevant. Astronomical records from the early 1800s document unusual meteor activity. The Leonid meteor shower of November 1833 produced what witnesses described as the most intense meteor storm in recorded history. Estimates suggest up to 240,000 meteors per hour. The sky appeared to be raining fire. More significantly, records from 1811 through 1817 describe persistent, unusual celestial phenomena. Multiple comets visible to the naked eye. Unusual aurora displays, far south of normal ranges. Atmospheric luminescence that couldn't be attributed to known causes. William Herschel, the astronomer who discovered Uranus, wrote in his private notes in 1816, "The celestial phenomena of recent years suggest perturbations in the solar system of unusual magnitude. Whether these relate to the atmospheric abnormalities currently affecting Earth remains speculative, but the correlation cannot be dismissed." The correlation he hesitated to state directly becomes clearer when examining the complete pattern. Unusual celestial activity from 1811-1817. Atmospheric disruption beginning in 1815. Global mudflows and flooding from 1816-1820. Massive population displacement and demographic anomalies appearing in the 1820s-1850s. And physical evidence of rapid burial of existing structures requiring elevation of street levels across every major city. What emerges is a picture of catastrophic disruption on a global scale. Not gradual change. Not localized disasters. A worldwide event that buried the existing ground level, disrupted populations, and required complete reconstruction of urban infrastructure. The buried first floors aren't anomalies explained by gradual street raising. They're evidence of rapid burial by massive mudflow events associated with atmospheric disruption in the early 1800s. The empty buildings in 1860s photographs aren't abandoned structures. They're excavated structures being gradually reoccupied after being buried and then partially cleared. The orphan crisis isn't a social problem. It's a demographic symptom of population disruption and replacement following catastrophe. This interpretation explains the otherwise inexplicable elements. Why there are no engineering records for raising street levels. Because they didn't raise the streets. They excavated buried buildings and reconstructed at the new ground level created by mudflow deposition. Why demographic data shows repopulation rather than growth? Because populations were indeed being reestablished after displacement, or worse. Why children appeared without family histories? Because family structures and record-keeping systems had been disrupted by catastrophic events. The evidence exists in plain sight. Every buried first floor, every subterranean window, every basement that was originally a ground-level room. They're all testifying to the same event. Something happened in the early 1800s that buried the existing world under layers of mud and required human civilization to reconstruct itself at a higher elevation. The implications are staggering. If this interpretation is correct, then the civilization we think of as 19th century wasn't building new cities. It was excavating and reoccupying buried cities. The grand architecture we attribute to Victorian-era construction might actually be pre-catastrophe construction that survived burial and was claimed by post-catastrophe populations. This would explain the persistent mystery of 19th century building techniques. How did they achieve such architectural sophistication so quickly after the supposedly primitive 18th century? They didn't. They were moving into buildings that already existed, making repairs and modifications, and claiming them as new construction. It would explain the strange uniformity of architectural styles across vast distances before global communication systems existed. They weren't independently developing similar styles. They were all working with buildings from the same pre-catastrophe civilization. It would explain why so many buildings from the 1800s appear to be sized for larger occupants. The doorways that seem unnecessarily tall, the ceilings that dwarf human scale, the furniture that appears oversized. They weren't designed for the people using them in the 1800s. They were designed by whoever built them before the catastrophe. The buried first floors are evidence of a reset, not a gradual historical transition, but a catastrophic event that buried one iteration of civilization and required survivors to excavate and rebuild. The mud layer, visible in every excavation, present beneath every modern city, isn't accumulated debris from centuries of human activity. It's a deposition layer from a specific event in the early 1800s that changed everything. And if that event happened once, the physical evidence suggests it could happen again. The uniformity of the mud layer implies a repeating phenomenon, not a unique occurrence. Excavations that reach deeper levels often find multiple buried horizons, suggesting previous cycles of burial and reconstruction. This is why the evidence has been reinterpreted and explained away, not because of conspiracy, but because accepting what the evidence actually shows would mean accepting that human civilization has been reset catastrophically within living historical memory. It would mean our cities aren't as old as we think. Our architectural heritage isn't as original as we claim, and our timeline of continuous human progress is fundamentally wrong. The buried first floors stand as silent witnesses. Beneath every city, under every street, the evidence waits. The mud that shouldn't be there. The windows that should be above ground. The doorways that should open to streets, not basements. They're all telling the same story. Civilization was buried. Recently. Completely. And what we call history is actually the story of excavation and recovery, not creation and progress. The truth is literally buried under our feet. Every time a construction crew digs down and finds another layer of streets, another set of buried buildings, another horizon that shouldn't exist. They're uncovering evidence of the reset. And every time that evidence is explained away as gradual accumulation or intentional construction, the real story gets buried deeper than the buildings themselves.